He was wearing a gray work shirt with a grease stain near the collar when he walked into the most expensive hotel in Chicago. Nobody looked at him twice. Nobody thought to. He carried a clipboard and a worn toolbox and moved through the marble lobby like a man who understood exactly where he didn't belong. But Ethan Ryder wasn't thinking about the way people looked at him. He was thinking about the ventilation intake on the east wall and why it was humming at the wrong frequency. He was thinking about the woman in the navy blazer across the lobby, the one everyone was watching like she hung the stars, and the small silver pin on her lapel that didn't match anything she was wearing. He was thinking that someone in this building was going to get hurt today, and he was thinking that no one was going to listen to him. If you're watching this right now, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit, like if you stay until the end. The elevator doors opened at 6:47 in the morning, and Ethan Ryder stepped into the lobby of the Ashford Grand carrying a toolbox that had seen better decades. He stopped just inside the entrance and looked up. The ceiling was maybe 40 feet high, all pale limestone and brushed brass fixtures, the kind of place where the light itself seemed expensive. A fountain ran along the far wall, barely audible beneath the ambient noise of early morning arrivals. Luggage wheels on polished stone, soft jazz from speakers he couldn't see, the low murmur of conversations happening in at least 3 languages. A woman in a white blazer stood near the concierge desk, talking into an earpiece with the practiced calm of someone who had been managing disasters since before breakfast. Ethan noted the exits. East corridor, service hallway to the left of the front desk, emergency stairwell behind the elevator bank. He'd read the building's schematics twice the night before, but reading a building and standing inside one were different things. The reading told you where things were supposed to be. Standing inside told you where they actually were. The maintenance contract was straightforward. Pre-event inspection of the hotel's emergency systems before a high-profile corporate event scheduled for 10 that morning. Fire suppression, ventilation controls, secondary power, communications redundancy. His company, Ridgeline Facility Services, had held the contract for 14 months. This was Ethan's 3rd visit to the property. He pulled out his work order and started toward the service desk near the east corridor. "Excuse me." The voice came from his left. He turned. A security officer, late 20s, clean uniform, the slightly rigid posture of someone who'd been in the job long enough to feel important, but not long enough to know what real trouble looked like, was looking at him with the expression people reserved for uninvited guests. "Deliveries are through the loading dock on Walker," the officer said. "You can't come through the main entrance with that." Ethan held up the work order. "Maintenance inspection. I have a contract with the property." The officer looked at the clipboard, looked at Ethan's shirt, looked at the toolbox. "Someone from facilities should have met you at the service entrance." "They were supposed to. No one showed." "I'll need to verify your credentials." "That's fine." He waited while the officer made a call. Across the lobby, 3 black SUVs pulled up outside the glass entrance, and a small procession of people came through the revolving door. Assistants, what looked like legal counsel carrying leather document cases, a pair of private security in plain clothes who moved the way military people moved, efficient and scanning and quietly alert. And then her. Ethan registered her the way he registered most things. Not dramatically, but completely. Claire Ashford walked through her own hotel lobby like she'd already decided what was going to happen that day, and was simply showing up to confirm it. 30, maybe 31, dark blazer over a pale blouse, hair pulled back but not tightly, more like she'd done it quickly that morning and hadn't thought about it since. She was talking to 2 people simultaneously, nodding at something one of them said while reading something on her phone, and she didn't slow down for any of it. Ethan looked at the pin on her lapel. It was small, silver, shaped like a narrow teardrop or maybe a flame. He couldn't tell from across the lobby. It sat just below her left collarbone, slightly crooked, like it had been put on in a hurry. He'd noticed it because the rest of her presentation was precise. The blazer sat cleanly on her shoulders. The documents under her arm were aligned. The pin was the one thing that was slightly off. Maybe it was nothing. Probably it was nothing. He looked away. "Okay," the security officer said, returning. "You're cleared. Facilities is sending someone down to escort you. I'll need access to the mechanical room on sub-level 2 and the HVAC control panels for floors 8 through 12. That's the executive level." I know. It's in the work order. The officer looked at him for a moment in a way that communicated quite clearly that he didn't love this arrangement. Wait here. Ethan waited. He spent the 12 minutes standing near the service desk watching the lobby. Not because he was bored, he wasn't capable of boredom in the way most people described it, but because standing still in a place gave you things that moving through it didn't. You noticed rhythms. You noticed what was supposed to be happening and what was actually happening, and the gap between those two things. The gap, this morning, was in the east wall. There was a ventilation intake grill set into the limestone about 8 feet up, just above a decorative planter. From where he was standing, he could hear a low harmonic coming from it. Not the normal white noise hum of a functioning air handler, but something slightly lower in pitch, slightly irregular. A resonance problem, possibly, or a partial blockage, or something in the system running under conditions it wasn't designed for. He wrote it down on his clipboard. A facilities manager named Hal arrived looking harassed, wearing a polo shirt with the hotel logo and carrying a radio that crackled every 30 seconds. "Sorry for the wait," Hal said, not sounding sorry. "We've got the Ashford event this morning, so everything's running about 40% more complicated than usual." "What's the Ashford event?" "Beth Ashford, the owner's daughter. She runs the biotech company, Ashford Dynamics. She's signing some massive merger deal in the conference room on 10. Been in the planning for 6 months. Every executive and his lawyer is here." Hal started walking toward the service corridor. "Let's get you through the mechanical check before 9 so we can stay out of their way. I need to check the ventilation system for floors 8 through 12. You can check the panels in sublevel 2. That's where the controls are. I'd also like to do a physical inspection of the intake infrastructure on the east side." Hal slowed. "The east side is near the executive corridor." "I'm aware." "That's going to be a problem this morning." "It'll take 20 minutes. Hal looked at his radio like he was considering whether to use it. "Let me see what I can do." Sublevel 2 smelled like concrete and machine oil, and the particular kind of institutional neglect that accumulates in places only technicians ever see. Ethan moved through it methodically, panel by panel, checking what was supposed to be checked. Most of it was fine. The fire suppression system was current. Secondary power routing looked clean. Emergency lighting batteries were at acceptable charge. The HVAC panel for the executive floor was not fine. He stood in front of it for a long time. The configuration was wrong in a way that wasn't immediately obvious. You'd have to know what you were looking at, and you'd have to know what it was supposed to look like. And even then, you might convince yourself it was a maintenance oversight or a systems update implemented poorly. The air handler for floors 9 through 11 had been reconfigured so that its pressure differential ran slightly lower than standard. Not dramatically lower. Not low enough to trigger an automated alert, but low enough that in a sealed space, a conference room with upgraded soundproofing and electronic door locks, for example, the air exchange rate would drop below the threshold required for adequate ventilation. Below the threshold required, specifically, if someone wanted to introduce something into the air supply and ensure it concentrated instead of dispersing. Ethan stood very still for a moment. He looked at the configuration again, checked it against the spec sheet in his work order, checked it a second time. Then he wrote everything down. He found Hal in the corridor outside. "The HVAC configuration for 9 through 11 has been altered," Ethan said. "The pressure differential is running about 12% below standard. In a sealed room, that's going to cause a significant drop in air exchange." Hal frowned at the clipboard. "Our system didn't flag anything." "It wouldn't flag it. The change is within tolerance for an open floor plan. But the conference room on 10 has reinforced doors and electronic locks. In a sealed configuration, you're looking at maybe 40% of normal air exchange. That could just be a calibration issue from the last maintenance cycle." "It could be," Ethan said. "When was the last maintenance cycle?" Hal checked his tablet. 6 weeks ago. "Who signed off on it?" "Another check." "External contractor, Apex Systems Solutions." Ethan wrote the name down. "I'd like to look at the intake infrastructure on the east corridor," he said again, "and I need someone to know about the HVAC configuration before the event starts." Hal's radio crackled. He listened to it. "Look, I'll flag it with the building manager, but I can't get you into the east corridor right now." They're setting up for the event, and I've got security breathing down my neck about access. Come back through at 9:30 after they've cleared for the signing, and we can do the physical inspection then. The event starts at 10, so 9:30 gives you 30 minutes. Ethan looked at him. I need to speak to someone in security. Now, Shigi Guam. The head of hotel security was a man named Garrett, 45, former Chicago PD, the kind of person who'd spent 20 years learning to read situations quickly and had started to mistake that skill for the ability to read everything correctly. He listened to Ethan for about 90 seconds. The HVAC configuration could be a maintenance issue, Garrett said. You said yourself it's within tolerance. Within tolerance for an open floor plan, not for a sealed conference room. We'll have the room at normal occupancy. Air won't be an issue. That depends on what's in the air. Garrett looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Taking in the worn shirt, the toolbox, the grease stain, something shifted behind his eyes. Not hostility exactly, more like recalibration. What exactly are you suggesting? Garrett asked. I'm suggesting the HVAC for the executive floor has been deliberately modified. I'm suggesting you verify who the Apex Systems Solutions contractor was, who did the last maintenance cycle, and whether they had clearance. And I'm suggesting that someone check the pin that Ms. Ashford is wearing on her lapel. A long pause. The pin. Small, silver, slightly crooked. It doesn't match the rest of her presentation, and she doesn't strike me as someone who wears things that don't match. Garrett set down his coffee. You want me to go tell the CEO of Ashford Dynamics that a maintenance worker thinks her jewelry is suspicious? I want you to have someone verify what it is. Son, Garrett said, and the word landed with the particular weight of a man who'd decided a conversation was over. I appreciate you doing your job. I'm going to ask you to let me do mine. He picked up his radio and said something into it, and 30 seconds later a second security officer appeared at the door of the small office they'd been standing in. Kevin's going to walk you back to the service area, Garrett said. We appreciate Ridgeline's work this morning. Ethan looked at him for a moment, then he picked up his toolbox. The conference room on 10, he said. You need to check the air intake on the east wall before anyone goes in there. Have a good morning, Garrett said. They walked him through the service corridor and back past the lobby. Kevin, the second officer, was younger than the first one, less certain of his own authority, and he kept a little more distance than was probably protocol. At the edge of the lobby, Ethan stopped. Claire Ashford was crossing toward the elevators, her small entourage moving with her. She was laughing at something one of the lawyers had said, a real laugh, slightly surprised, like she hadn't expected it to be funny. Her head tipped back slightly. The silver pin on her lapel caught the light. From this distance, with better light, Ethan could see it more clearly. The shape wasn't quite a teardrop. It was closer to a narrow capsule, slightly elongated, with a seam around the middle that caught differently than the rest of the surface. Not decorative. Functional. Kevin's hand landed on his arm. Sir, this way. That pin on her jacket, Ethan said. He wasn't talking to Kevin. He was thinking out loud, which was a habit he'd never entirely broken. Sir. Someone put that on her, Ethan said. She didn't put it on herself. Look at the angle. It's crooked to the left because whoever attached it was standing in front of her and right-handed. Kevin steered him firmly toward the service exit. The elevator doors opened. Claire stepped inside. Her assistant said something, and she nodded, still reading her phone. The doors closed. Ethan stood at the service exit and looked at the floor indicator above the elevator bank. Watched the number climb. 7, 8, 9, 10. The indicator stopped. He looked at his clipboard, looked at the name he'd written down, Apex Systems Solutions, and the configuration numbers from the HVAC panel, and the time on his watch. 6:59 a.m., 3 hours before the signing. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. The first 3 went to voicemail. The fourth, a contact at the city's fire marshal office, a woman named Desmond, who owed him a favor from a job 2 years ago, picked up on the third ring. I need someone to pull the permit records for a contractor called Apex Systems Solutions, Ethan said. Any work they've done in the last 6 months at the Ashford Grand on Michigan Avenue. Ethan, it's 7 in the morning. I know. A pause. He could hear her breathing. What am I looking for? Anything that shouldn't be there, he said, or anything that should be there and isn't. He sat down on the edge of a planter near the service exit, toolbox between his feet, and looked up at the building's glass facade, reaching toward a flat white sky. Somewhere on the 10th floor, Claire Ashford was preparing to sign the most important document of her professional life. And the air in that room was already wrong. Desmond called back at 7:34 a.m. Ethan was still outside, sitting on the same planter, the toolbox between his feet and his clipboard balanced on his knee. He'd been going through the HVAC numbers again, running the math on the air exchange rate in a room the size of the executive conference suite on the 10th floor, and the numbers kept coming back to the same place. Not immediately dangerous, but wrong in a way that suggested intention. Things that were wrong by accident were usually wrong in random ways. This wasn't random. This was calibrated. Apex Systems Solutions, Desmond said. She sounded like she'd been at her desk for an hour already, which she probably had. Licensed contractor, commercial HVAC and building systems. Chicago-based. They've pulled 6 permits in the last 8 months. Any at the Ashford Grand? 1. Filed 11 weeks ago. Routine maintenance inspection on floors 8 through 12, HVAC and ventilation infrastructure. Who signed off on site access? He heard her moving papers. Authorization was countersigned by a corporate liaison. Name on file is D. Cole, Ashford Dynamics Executive Office. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You still there? Desmond asked. Yeah. He wrote the name down. Can you pull the ownership registration on Apex Systems Solutions? Articles of incorporation, registered agents, whatever's on file with the state. That's going to take me a little more time. I'll wait. He hung up and looked at the building again. The morning had moved on around him. The sidewalk traffic on Michigan Avenue had thickened, taxis cycling through the hotel entrance, a group of conference attendees with lanyards gathering near the door. The sky above the building was still flat and white, the kind of February sky that didn't commit to anything. He thought about his daughter. Maya was 7. She was at school right now, probably arguing with her teacher about something. She had a gift for identifying the precise flaw in any stated rule, which was exhausting and also quietly wonderful. He'd packed her lunch this morning at 6:15, turkey and cheese, apple slices, the crackers she liked. He'd been thinking about the job while he packed it, going over the schematics in his head, and he'd almost forgotten the crackers. Almost. He thought about the pin on Claire Ashford's lapel. He thought about the name D. Cole, and the countersigned authorization, and the 11-week head start that gave someone with a plan. Then he stood up, picked up his toolbox, and went back inside. The lobby was more crowded now, the morning having accumulated momentum of its own. Ethan moved through it without hurrying, which was the only way he knew how to move through anything. Hurrying drew attention. Hurrying told people you were somewhere you weren't supposed to be, walking like you belonged somewhere, like you'd walked that particular route 100 times and expected to walk it 100 more. That was how you got through spaces that were technically closed to you. He made it back to the service corridor before anyone stopped him. Hal was not in the mechanical room. Hal's radio was sitting on the workbench next to a half-empty coffee mug, which suggested Hal had stepped away recently and intended to come back. Ethan set his toolbox down, pulled out his inspection forms, and started working. The HVAC panel looked exactly the way he'd left it. He photographed it anyway. 3 angles, close enough to read the configuration numbers clearly. Then he pulled the maintenance log from the bracket on the wall and photographed that too. The log went back 18 months. The entry from 11 weeks ago was brief, 3 lines, signed by an Apex technician with a name Ethan couldn't quite read. The handwriting was deliberately unclear in the way that certain signatures are when their owners don't want to be identified. He put the log back. He needed to get to the East Corridor intake. Not through the front. Not now, with the event security deployed and Garrett's team already watching for him. But the building's schematics had shown a service chase running parallel to the East Corridor, an access pathway for technicians that ran behind the wall panels on the executive floor. It was narrow. It wasn't comfortable, but it connected sub-level 2 directly to the east wall intake infrastructure on 10. He found the access hatch at the back of the mechanical room, behind a rack of replacement filters. The hatch had a standard quarter-turn fastener. He turned it, opened the panel, and looked into a space about 22 inches wide and lit by a single fluorescent strip that buzzed faintly and emitted roughly 40% of the light it was supposed to. Ethan was not a large man, lean, with the economical build of someone who'd spent years needing to fit into tight spaces. But 22 inches was still a tight fit with a tool bag. He left the full toolbox and took only what he needed: a handheld meter, a pen light, a small camera, a flathead screwdriver. He climbed in. Walton. The service chase on 10 smelled like insulation and old wiring. Ethan moved along it carefully, one hand on the wall, the other holding the pen light. He could hear the building around him in a way you couldn't hear it from the corridors. The deep mechanical respiration of the HVAC system, the muffled low-frequency rumble of the elevator cables, the faint hum of electrical conduit. The east wall intake was exactly where the schematic said it would be. He reached it after about 4 minutes of moving through the chase, and he crouched in front of it and pointed the pen light at the grill. He looked for a long time. The grill itself was clean. Recently cleaned, actually, which was notable because the surrounding surfaces in the chase were dusty in the uniform way that spaces accumulate dust when no one's been attending to them. Someone had cleaned specifically this grill and nothing else. He looked at the housing behind the grill. Standard intake housing, powder-coated steel, with the normal mounting brackets and the flex connection leading back to the air handler. All standard, all correct. Except for the small bracket mounted to the interior wall of the housing, just behind and to the right of where the grill sat. It was a neat little thing, barely the size of a pack of cards, bolted through with 2 machine screws. It had no label. It had no wire connections that he could see from this angle, though there was a small port on one side that could accept a wireless module. It wasn't part of the building's systems. He photographed it. Multiple angles. He didn't touch it. He pulled out his handheld meter and held it near the housing, cycling through the readings. No active emissions on any of the standard frequencies. Whatever the bracket was for, it wasn't currently transmitting or operating. Either it needed an external trigger, or it had already done what it was designed to do, or it was waiting. He thought about the pin on Claire Ashford's lapel again, the slight seam around the middle, the way it hadn't matched. He thought about the sealed conference room with its reinforced doors and its deliberately degraded air exchange rate. He thought about the word trigger. He moved back through the chase, faster now. Hal was back when Ethan emerged from behind the filter rack. He looked up from his radio with an expression that traveled quickly through surprise, irritation, and a stopping point somewhere near alarm. How did you... That access panel isn't cleared for... There's a foreign device mounted in the east wall intake housing on 10, Ethan said. I don't know what it is. I know it doesn't belong there, and I know that whoever installed it cleaned the surrounding grill and left everything else dusty, which means they knew where to look, and they didn't want it to be obvious. He set his meter and camera on the workbench. I need to talk to Garrett again. Hal looked at the camera, looked at the access panel, which Ethan had left open, looked back at Ethan. You went in there without authorization. Hal. I can't. This is my job on the line if... Hal. Ethan waited until the man looked at him directly. There is something mounted in that intake housing that is not part of this building's systems. There's a conference room on 10 where the air exchange rate has been cut by 40% in a sealed configuration. And there is a woman upstairs right now who is about to walk into a situation that has been built specifically around her. He picked up the camera. I need to talk to Garrett. Hal's jaw moved like he was chewing on several responses simultaneously. Then he picked up his radio. Garrett did not look like a man who enjoyed being wrong. He was built for decisiveness, the kind of person who made quick reads and moved on, because in his previous career hesitating cost you more than being wrong. Being wrong you could recover from. Hesitating sometimes you couldn't. He looked at Ethan's photographs for 23 seconds. Then he said, Kevin, get the bomb squad liaison on the phone. Kevin, who had been leaning against the wall with the studied casualness of someone trying to project that they weren't listening, straightened immediately and walked out. The device, Ethan said. It's not explosive. The housing is too small and the configuration is wrong. But it has a port that could accept a wireless transmitter. And if it's a dispersal unit of some kind, what kind of dispersal unit? I don't know. That's what needs to be determined. He pulled up the photograph of the device on his camera. But if someone wanted to introduce something into the air supply of a sealed room, something that would look like a medical event rather than an attack, this is how you do it. You degrade the air exchange so the concentration builds faster, and you trigger the dispersal device remotely at the right moment. Garrett looked at him, not the way he'd looked at him the first time, with the quick calculation that ended in dismissal, a different kind of looking. You said a name earlier, Garrett said. D. Cole. Damian Cole, COO of Ashford Dynamics. He countersigned the access authorization that got the Apex contractor into this building 11 weeks ago. Ethan set the camera on the desk. He's upstairs right now. Garrett stood up. What happened in the next 12 minutes happened fast, and most of it happened in ways that Ethan wasn't directly part of. He was kept in the security office while Garrett made calls, and Kevin relayed information, and two men Ethan hadn't seen before arrived in the building and spoke to Garrett in low voices with the close-lipped efficiency of people who did sensitive things for organizations that didn't have their names on the door. Through the glass partition of the office, Ethan watched the lobby. The normal morning rhythm of the hotel continued, which told him that whatever was being done quietly. No visible alert, no evacuation, no sign that the executive floor was aware of anything except the event it was preparing for. He thought about Maya. He thought about a job he'd had 5 years ago, before the maintenance work, before the smaller apartment in Pilsen, before the life got stripped down to just the essential things. He'd been a safety systems engineer at a firm called Meridian Consulting, the kind of role where you flew to different cities and looked at industrial facilities and wrote reports about what could go wrong and how to prevent it. It was good work. He'd been good at it, and then he'd written a report that someone hadn't wanted written, and everything after that had been the consequence of that one document. He pushed the thought away. Not now. Garrett came back in. The bomb squad liaison confirmed the device in the intake housing is not explosive, he said. They're designating it an unknown dispersal mechanism and treating it as a chemical threat until they know otherwise. The 10th floor is being quietly cleared. Claire Ashford is being moved? Her team is being told there's a maintenance issue requiring a brief delay. Standard language. And Damian Cole? Garrett's expression shifted in a small way that told Ethan the answer before he said it. Cole left the property 20 minutes ago. His assistant says he had an off-site meeting. Of course he did. Ethan looked at the lobby through the glass. He'll be watching remotely, waiting for something to happen. We're working on locating him. If he sees the 10th floor activity, he'll know something went wrong. Ethan stood up. You need to make the floor look normal. Whatever's happening up there, it needs to look from the outside like the event is still proceeding. Garrett was quiet for a moment. That's what we're doing, but the meeting can't actually proceed. We don't know enough about the device yet. The device is already in place. Removing it changes the observable situation. Ethan looked at him. Cole isn't watching the device. He's watching the outcome. As long as the outcome looks like the meeting is continuing, he has no reason to change anything. Garrett stared at him. You've done this before, he said. Not quite a question. Ethan didn't answer that. I need access to the event management office on 10, he said instead. And I need someone to quietly get close to Damian Cole's last known position and sit on it without making contact. Well, the event management office was a narrow room adjacent to the conference suite, separated from it by a shared wall and accessed through a service corridor that required a key card Garrett had to physically sign out to him. Ethan went in alone, closed the door, and stood in the small space looking at the monitors. The room had been set up as a coordination hub for the morning's event. 4 screens showed camera feeds from the conference room, the corridor outside it, the elevator bank, and the lobby. A 5th screen showed a control interface for the room's integrated systems: climate, lighting, communications, lockdown. The lockdown controls were what held his attention. The system was a Sentinel-4, a high-end integrated building security platform used in executive facilities and data centers. He'd worked with one before, years ago, on a project in Minneapolis. The Sentinel-4 could seal a space completely. Electromagnetic locks on all doors, independent ventilation control, communications blackout. It was designed for genuine emergency scenarios. The kind of scenario where you needed to guarantee that nothing came in and nothing went out. The kind of scenario, he realized, that would make a sealed room with a degraded air exchange rate significantly more dangerous than an unsealed one. He pulled up the system logs on the control interface. The Sentinel-4 kept a time-stamped record of every configuration change, every override, every user access event. He went back 11 weeks. There it was, an access event 11 weeks ago at 2:14 a.m. from a user credential designated Apex-Tech-7. A series of configuration changes made over 41 minutes. Not just the HVAC settings. Someone had also modified the emergency lockdown protocol, reprogramming the trigger conditions so that a specific combination of sensor readings would activate the full lockdown automatically without requiring manual input, without requiring anyone to push a button. The lockdown would trigger itself. All Damien Cole needed was for the conditions to be right. Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Desmond. Apex Systems Solutions, she said. Registered in Illinois 14 months ago. Registered agent is a law firm in the Loop. Shell company setup. Pretty standard. But the original incorporation documents list a co-founder. A pause. Name on file is Marcus Vale. He's on the board of 3 other companies. Another pause, longer. One of them is a private equity fund that holds a significant position in the company that Ashford Dynamics is trying to acquire through this merger. Ethan stood very still. If the merger falls apart, he said slowly, or if Ashford Dynamics goes into crisis, the target company's valuation drops, Desmond said, and whoever holds the right position at the right time makes a significant amount of money. How much money? A pause. The position is structured as a short. If Ashford Dynamics stock drops 30%, she stopped. Ethan, we're talking 9 figures. He looked at the Sentinel-4 control interface, looked at the time-stamped configuration changes from 11 weeks ago. Send me everything you have, he said. Documents, registration filings, the whole picture. Already sending. Ethan, her voice dropped half a register. You need to call the FBI. I'm working on it. He hung up. He stood in the event management office for a moment and looked at the camera feeds. The conference room was empty now, the long table laid with water glasses and legal pads. The chairs arranged for a meeting that wasn't going to happen the way anyone had planned. The corridor outside it was quiet. The elevator bank showed a single figure stepping out. A hotel staff member, moving quickly, head down. On the lobby feed, he could see the main entrance. The morning had continued outside. Taxis, luggage, people moving through a normal Thursday. He thought about Claire Ashford's face when she'd laughed at something in the lobby. The way it had been genuinely surprised, like she'd allowed herself a moment of not being exactly who she was supposed to be. He thought about a 9-figure short position and 41 minutes at 2:14 a.m. and a small bracket mounted to the interior wall of an intake housing. He pulled out his phone again and called the number Garrett had given him. The lockdown system has been reprogrammed, Ethan said when Garrett picked up. The Sentinel-4 will trigger automatically under specific sensor conditions. Someone doesn't need to push a button. The system does it for them. You need to get your technical team into that control interface and identify the trigger parameters before anyone goes back into that room. A beat of silence. How long have you known this? Garrett asked. About 4 minutes. How are you? Garrett stopped. You have access to the Sentinel system? I'm in the event management office. A longer pause this time. Ethan could hear Garrett breathing, could almost hear him deciding whether to be angry about this and concluding correctly that being angry about it was a luxury he didn't have time for. Stay there, Garrett said. Don't touch anything. I'm sending someone up. Ethan looked at the monitor showing the conference room, the empty chairs, the untouched water glasses. He thought about the modified HVAC settings, the foreign device in the intake housing, the reprogrammed lockdown, the countersigned authorization, the shell company, the short position, the 9 figures waiting to materialize the moment something went wrong on this floor. 11 weeks of preparation, coordinated across multiple systems, multiple entities, multiple people. This wasn't improvised, this was engineered, and the only flaw in it, the only thing that hadn't been accounted for, was a maintenance technician in a worn gray shirt who'd walked through the lobby at 6:47 in the morning and heard a ventilation intake humming at the wrong frequency. He sat down in the chair in front of the monitors and waited. Garrett's technician arrived 8 minutes later. A compact woman named Solis, 30s, who came in carrying a laptop and took one look at the Sentinel-4 interface and said, "Oh, that's not good," in the flat tone of someone who'd been trained to keep their emotional responses professional but hadn't quite finished that training. "The trigger parameters," Ethan said. "Look at the emergency protocol subroutine." She found it in about 90 seconds. He watched her read it, watched her face. "It's set to trigger lockdown," she said, "if the room's CO2 sensors read above a certain threshold." "Which threshold?" She looked at the screen. "One that you'd hit pretty quickly in a sealed room with a degraded air exchange rate," Ethan finished. She turned around and looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, on the faces of people who just understood the full shape of something bad. Not panic, just the specific, quiet sobriety of comprehension. "Someone collapses," she said. "Maybe a CO2 spike, maybe something from the dispersal device. Either way, the CO2 level rises. The sensors read it. The lockdown triggers automatically, sealing everyone inside. Emergency services respond to a medical incident but can't get in. The air gets worse, and the whole time it looks like a malfunction." "Not a malfunction," Ethan said. "A perfect medical emergency. No fingerprints, no obvious cause. Just a room full of executives and a CEO who collapsed under pressure and a merger that falls apart in the chaos." Solis turned back to the screen. Her hands were already moving. Down the corridor in the quiet executive conference room, the untouched water glasses sat in a row on the long table, and the chairs waited and the ventilation system pushed air through its altered configuration at 12% below what it should have been, building toward a threshold no one was supposed to notice until it was too late. Ethan watched the monitors and thought about the name Damian Cole, and about the countersignature on an authorization form from 11 weeks ago, and about what kind of person spent 11 weeks building something this careful and then walked out of the building 20 minutes before it was supposed to detonate. The kind of person who expected it to work. The kind of person who'd done something like this before. Solis worked for 11 minutes straight without saying anything. Ethan sat in the chair in front of the monitors and let her work. He'd learned a long time ago that the most useful thing you could do while a competent person was doing something technical was stay out of their way and keep your mouth shut. He watched the camera feeds instead. The conference room, still empty, the corridor, a hotel staff member wheeling a cart toward the service elevator. The lobby, the morning crowd thickening near the front desk. "Okay," Solis said finally. "You found it?" "I found all of it." She turned the laptop so he could see the screen. The trigger subroutine is nested inside the emergency protocol stack. It looks like a standard parameter update from the outside, which is why it didn't flag in the routine system audit. But it's a secondary process that runs on top of the normal lockdown logic. She scrolled through lines of configuration code. When the CO2 sensors in conference room A hit 450 parts per million above baseline, the Sentinel-4 reads it as a hazmat event and initiates full lockdown. Electromagnetic seals on all entry points, ventilation isolation, communications suppression. "Can you disable it?" "I already did." She said it simply, without pride. "I rolled the emergency protocol back to the factory configuration from 14 months ago, before Apex touched anything." She closed the laptop. "But the dispersal device in the intake housing is still there. Until someone physically removes it and analyzes it, we don't know what it contains." "The device needs a wireless trigger," Ethan said. "Something external sends a signal, the device activates and releases whatever's inside into the air supply. If no one sends the signal, it doesn't activate." He looked at the conference room feed. "Cole left the building 20 minutes ago. He's going to be watching for signs that the meeting is proceeding normally. At some point, he'll trigger the device remotely, or he'll have a fail-safe, something that activates if the meeting runs past a certain time." Solis looked at him. "You think there's a timer?" "I think someone who spent 11 weeks engineering this didn't build a plan that depended entirely on a remote signal that could be interrupted." He stood up. "I need to talk to Garrett." He was halfway to the door when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but the area code was Chicago. He answered. "Is this Ethan Ryder?" The voice was male, mid-40s, with the measured cadence of someone choosing their words carefully. "Who's asking?" "My name is Agent Dara Whitfield, FBI Chicago Field Office." A brief pause. I'm told you've been having an interesting morning. Desmond. She'd made the call herself rather than waiting for him. How much do you know? Ethan asked. I know what your contact sent us 30 minutes ago. Financial records, corporate registration documents, a timeline. Another pause. I'm also looking at the Apex Systems Solutions maintenance log that someone just transmitted from what appears to be a hotel security system. That came from you? Yes. Mr. Ryder, I need you to stop doing things for approximately 10 minutes and tell me exactly where you are. Whitfield arrived on the 10th floor 11 minutes later, which was fast enough that Ethan revised upward his estimate of how seriously she'd taken Desmond's call. She came with two other agents, both younger, both moving with the particular economy of people who'd been briefed in transit and were still processing. She was not what he'd expected from the phone voice. Mid-40s was right, but she was smaller than the voice had suggested, and she had the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd been in the middle of something else when the call came in. Her jacket was buttoned wrong, the second button through the third hole, and she hadn't fixed it yet, which Ethan found more reassuring than if she'd been polished. Polished people in her position sometimes confused the appearance of control with actual control. She shook his hand and looked at him with direct, assessing eyes. Walk me through it, she said. From the beginning, the short version. He gave her 6 minutes. She listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When he finished, she looked at Solis, who confirmed the technical details in another 3 minutes. The dispersal device, Whitfield said. You said it has a wireless trigger port. A port that could accept a wireless module. Whether there's currently a module installed, I couldn't confirm from my position in the service chase. We're going to need to get a team to that intake housing before we do anything else. She turned to one of her agents. Get Hazmat on the phone. I want a team in that service chase within the hour. She turned back to Ethan. Damian Cole, last known location? Left the property approximately 40 minutes ago. Garrett's team has been trying to locate him. We have resources for that. She was already moving, already pulling out her own phone. Mr. Ryder, I need you to stay available. Don't leave the property. Don't make any more unauthorized entries into building systems. She said the last part without particular emphasis, the way you said things you needed to be on record as having said. There's something else, Ethan said. She stopped. The pin on Claire Ashford's lapel. She was wearing it when she arrived this morning. I haven't been able to confirm whether she still has it. Whitfield looked at him for a moment. What about it? The shape was wrong for a decorative pin, and it was applied crookedly, from the angle, by someone standing in front of her. She didn't put it on herself. He paused. If the dispersal device in the intake is the primary mechanism, the pin might be secondary, or it might be the actual mechanism, and the intake device is the distraction. The hallway was quiet for a moment. Where is she now? Whitfield asked. As far as I know, she was redirected to a holding area when the floor was cleared. Garrett would know exactly. Whitfield was already walking, phone to her ear. Ethan stood in the corridor for a moment and looked at the door to the conference room. Then he looked at his watch. 9:22 a.m. 38 minutes before the scheduled signing. He found Garrett at the security command post on 9, a repurposed storage room that now held 4 monitors, a radio console, and 3 people who all looked like they hadn't expected their Thursday to go this direction. Garrett was on the phone when Ethan walked in, and he held up one finger without looking away from the monitor he was watching. Ethan waited. Garrett hung up and turned around. His face had changed since the morning, not dramatically, but the way faces change when someone has spent several hours being wrong about something important. There was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Cole, he said. We have a location. He's in a parking structure on Wabash, about 4 blocks east. One of my people spotted his car 40 minutes ago and sat on it without making contact, like you said. He'll have a sight line to the building entrance from there, Ethan said. Or he'll be watching remotely. Either way, he's waiting. FBI has eyes on the location now. Garrett rubbed his jaw. Ms. Ashford is in room 1004. She's been told there's a security concern with the building systems. She's not particularly pleased about it. I need to talk to her. Garrett looked at him. Why? The pin on her lapel. I need to know where it came from, and I need to see it up close. The FBI. The FBI is setting up hazmat for the intake housing and coordinating the Cole surveillance. They have a lot of moving pieces. Ethan looked at him steadily. I need 3 minutes with Claire Ashford. Garrett held the look for a moment. Then he moved toward the door. I'll take you down. Room 104 was a standard executive suite. Sitting room, desk, view of the street below. The curtains were half drawn. When Garrett knocked and opened the door, Claire Ashford was standing near the window with her arms crossed and an expression that communicated, without ambiguity, that she was finished waiting for someone to tell her something real. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who'd introduced herself to no one, sat on the sofa with a tablet on her knees and the look of someone who'd learned to become invisible during her employer's difficult moments. Claire's eyes went to Garrett first, then to Ethan. She looked at the worn gray shirt, the toolbox he was still carrying because he'd never put it down. She looked at his face. You're not security, she said. No. Who are you? My name is Ethan Ryder. I'm a maintenance technician. I'm the person who found the problem with your building's ventilation system this morning. A beat. You're the one Garrett's been dealing with all morning, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes. She looked at Garrett. You spent 3 hours ignoring him and then called the FBI. Garrett said nothing, which was the only honest answer. Claire uncrossed her arms. All right, she said to Ethan. Talk. He gave her the short version, the same 6 minutes he'd given Whitfield, but different in the specific way that talking to someone about a threat to their own life required a different calibration than talking to a federal agent. He watched her face as he spoke. She was good at keeping it still, the kind of controlled stillness that people develop when they've learned that showing reaction in a room full of lawyers and executives costs them something. But around the eyes, he could see her processing it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Damien, she said finally. Just the name. Flat. Yes. How long has he been planning this? At least 11 weeks, possibly longer. The financial position that benefits from your company going into crisis was established before the Apex contractor accessed the building. She looked at the window. He pushed for this merger, she said slowly. He identified the target company. He managed the due diligence timeline. He set the signing date. A pause. He suggested this hotel. I know. She turned back to him. Her face had done something. Not collapsed, nothing like that, but reconfigured, like a structure shifting to accommodate new load. You said something about a pin. He nodded. You were wearing a pin on your lapel when you arrived this morning. Small, silver, slightly below your left collarbone. Can I see it? She looked down. Her hand moved to her lapel and stopped. The pin was gone. She looked up at him. It was there this morning. Someone, Damien's assistant, gave it to me in the car on the way over. She said it was a gift from the acquisition team, a token for the signing. Her voice stayed even, but something in it had gone very careful. I took it off when they moved me to this room. I thought I set it on the desk. They both looked at the desk. Clear surface, a notepad, a hotel pen. No pin. Priya, Claire said. Her assistant looked up from the tablet. Did you see me take off a pin when we came in here? Priya frowned. You set it on the bathroom counter. I saw you do it. Ethan was already moving toward the bathroom. The pin was on the edge of the counter, next to the soap dispenser. He crouched in front of it without touching it and looked at it carefully in the bathroom light. Up close, the seam around the middle was unmistakable. It ran in a clean line around the circumference of the piece, with a tolerance that suggested precision manufacturing. The surface was smooth and matte, not the kind of finish you put on something decorative. The kind of finish you put on something you didn't want to reflect light or draw attention. He straightened up. Don't touch it, he said to the room. Don't let anyone touch it. He called Whitfield. Dartek. The hazmat assessment of the pin took 40 minutes. Ethan spent most of them in the corridor outside room 1004, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his toolbox between his feet, because there were no chairs in the corridor, and he was tired in the specific way that comes not from physical exertion, but from sustained concentration over many hours. At some point, Garrett appeared and handed him a coffee from a cart somewhere. Ethan took it. The hazmat team got into the service chase. Garrett said, leaning against the wall. They're removing the intake device now. They're not saying much, but one of them used the word aerosolized on the radio and then stopped talking, so... Aerosolized means it's a liquid or powder suspension, Ethan said, designed to disperse through the air supply as fine particles. Is that bad? Depends entirely on what's in it. He drank the coffee. If it's something that incapacitates rather than kills, and if Cole was planning to frame it as a medical event, a mass fainting episode, cardiac incidents, something that looks like stress or contaminated food, then it would need to be something that metabolizes quickly. Something that would be hard to detect in a standard talk screen taken hours after the event. Garrett was quiet for a moment. He wasn't trying to kill her. A dead CEO is a criminal investigation. A CEO who collapses during a high-stress merger signing, along with half the room, and is hospitalized for observation. That's a story about corporate pressure and bad catering. Ethan looked at the wall across the corridor. The company goes into crisis management mode. The merger collapses, the stock drops, and 9 figures materializes in a short position held by a private equity fund connected to a shell company that a very careful man has kept 3 layers away from his own name. Garrett exhaled. He's been doing this a long time. Almost certainly. Whitfield appeared at the end of the corridor, walking fast, with the agent who'd been coordinating the Cole surveillance half a step behind her. The pin, she said as she got close. Preliminary analysis. It's a microdispersal device, hollow core, pressurized reservoir, designed to release on a specific temperature or remote trigger. The contents are being analyzed now, but the initial read suggests a synthetic compound, not a scheduled substance, which is how it cleared customs or procurement without flagging. Ethan looked at her. Not a scheduled substance yet. Yet. She acknowledged it with a slight nod. Designed to cause rapid onset dizziness, disorientation, cardiovascular stress. In a healthy adult, temporary incapacitation. In someone with an underlying condition. She stopped. Does Claire Ashford have an underlying condition? Ethan asked. Whitfield looked at him steadily. She has a documented heart arrhythmia. It's not publicly known. Her medical records are private, but someone with access to her private information would know. The corridor was quiet. Damian Cole had known. That was the only way this made sense. The pin wasn't incidental. It wasn't the distraction. The pin was the primary mechanism, personalized specifically to a woman whose heart wasn't quite right, designed to look like a medical episode that her own body had created. The intake device was the insurance policy. The pin was the murder weapon. Ethan stood up. Cole, he said, what's his status? Still in the parking structure on Wabash. Whitfield checked her phone. He made 2 outgoing calls in the last 20 minutes. We're working on the intercepts. He's going to try to trigger the pin remotely, Ethan said. If it has a wireless trigger, he'll want to activate it at the same time the meeting was supposed to be signing, 10 o'clock. If he sees nothing's happening, he might move the timeline. We can block the relevant frequency range in the immediate area. How quickly? She was already on the phone. From inside room 1004, Ethan could hear Claire Ashford's voice, low and controlled, talking to someone. He couldn't make out the words. The tone was the tone of someone who is keeping themselves together through the specific mechanism of focusing on the next thing instead of the full shape of what they were facing. He understood that mechanism well. He sat back down on the floor and waited. At 9:51 a.m., Whitfield came back to the corridor. We have the intercept on Cole's second call, she said. He was speaking to someone about a contingency. The call was brief. She paused. He used the phrase proceed with the secondary. We're not sure what that means yet. The secondary is the intake device, Ethan said immediately. He knows or suspects the pin has been neutralized. Maybe someone on his surveillance saw the hazmat activity on this floor. Maybe the pin stopped transmitting. He's switching to the intake device as the primary mechanism. The device is already being removed, but Cole doesn't know that. Ethan stood up again. From his position, the intake device is still in place. If he triggers it remotely at 10 o'clock, he expects the air supply on this floor to deliver the compound to the conference room. The room is empty. There's no one in there. I know, but Cole doesn't know we cleared the floor. He looked at her. He thinks the meeting is still happening. He's been watching the outside of the building and seen normal activity. That's what Garrett's team has been managing. From Cole's perspective, Everything is still on track. He paused. If he triggers the device at 10 and nothing happens, no news reports, no emergency response, no chaos, he's going to know the plan failed, and he'll run. Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. You want us to let him think it worked, she said, for long enough to take him into custody without a foot chase. She turned away and made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, speaking in the compressed, reference-heavy shorthand of someone managing multiple teams simultaneously. Ethan listened to her side of it and filled in the gaps. She was good at this. Not flashy, not dramatic, just methodical in the way that solved problems instead of looking like it was solving them. At 9:58 a.m., she came back. Cole is still in the parking structure, she said. Our technical team has isolated the frequency range he's most likely using for a remote trigger. We're not blocking it. We're going to let the signal through and monitor the attempt. She looked at Ethan. The device is out of the intake housing and in a containment unit in the service corridor. If he triggers it, nothing happens in the building, but we have a record of the attempt. And then? And then we take him. Ethan nodded. Ms. Ashford should be moved further from this floor, he said. Not because of the device. We've cleared that. But she's been in this room for 2 hours and she's going to need to be somewhere she can breathe. Whitfield looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. She asked about you, she said. About 10 minutes ago. Asked who you were. I mean, really who you were. What did you tell her? I told her you were the maintenance technician who found the problem. A pause. She asked if that was the whole story. Ethan picked up his toolbox. I'll take that as a no, she said. He didn't respond to that. At 10:03 a.m., 2 floors below them, in a parking structure on Wabash Avenue, a man named Damian Cole pressed send on a remote trigger application on a burner phone that he'd registered under a name that wasn't his. 4 blocks away, in a containment unit in a hotel service corridor, a small pressurized device received the signal and attempted to discharge its contents into an air intake that was no longer connected to anything. The signal was logged. The attempt was recorded, and 6 FBI agents, 2 of whom had been sitting in the parking structure for 40 minutes, in a vehicle with a cracked windshield and a broken interior dome light, took Damian Cole into custody at 10:04 a.m. while he was still watching his phone for news alerts that were never going to come. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He looked at the agents around him with the expression of a man whose primary emotion in that moment was not fear but a specific cold variety of disbelief. The disbelief of someone who'd built something carefully over a long period of time and could not quite process that it hadn't worked. One of the agents told him later, filling out paperwork in the field office, that he'd said only one thing in the parking structure before the Miranda warning. He'd said, "Who saw it?" Not a question. More like a man trying to locate the point of failure in a system he thought he'd controlled completely. Ethan was not in the parking structure. He didn't know what Cole said. He was standing in the corridor outside room 1004, holding his toolbox, when Whitfield came back and told him Cole was in custody. He nodded. "You should sit down," she said. You look like you've been standing since 6 in the morning." "I've been standing since 6 in the morning. Well," she gestured at the wall, which was an odd gesture, but he understood what she meant. "It's over." "The arrest," he said. "Not the rest of it." She looked at him. Cole had help, the financial position, the shell company, the synthetic compounds. None of that is a one-person operation. He leaned against the wall. "The arrest is the beginning of the rest of it." She was quiet for a moment. "You know a lot about how these things work." "I used to know more." She looked like she might ask about that, then decided against it. "We're going to need a full statement from you. Everything from this morning, in sequence." "I know." The door to room 1004 opened. Claire Ashford came out into the corridor. She'd taken the blazer off at some point. She was in the pale blouse now, sleeves pushed up, her hair slightly less controlled than it had been in the lobby. She looked at Whitfield, who nodded once. Then she looked at Ethan. He was aware, in a detached way, of how he looked. The worn shirt with the stain near the collar, the toolbox, the coffee cup Garrett had given him, still half full, held in his other hand. He'd been in this building for 3 hours, and he probably showed all of it. She looked at him for a long moment. "Is it done?" she asked. Cole is in custody, he said. The device from the intake has been secured. The pin is in evidence. The pin that was on my jacket? Yes. She processed that. Or she'd already processed it in the room and was now doing something else with it. The specific emotional work of standing in the aftermath of something that had almost happened. My assistant gave me that pin, she said. Priya. She's been with me for 2 years. She was given it by Cole's assistant, Ethan said carefully. The chain of custody was designed to look innocent at every link. Claire nodded slowly. She didn't know. Almost certainly not. Another pause. You found all of this, she said, starting from the ventilation system. The ventilation intake was humming at the wrong frequency. She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not gratitude exactly. Or not only that. More like the look of someone recalibrating a set of assumptions they'd been carrying for a long time. Garrett told me you came to him this morning, she said. Early, before anyone was in that room. Yes. He didn't listen. No. But you kept going anyway. He looked at her. That's generally how it works when you're right about something. Something moved across her face. A small thing. She looked away, and he could see her working through something. Not collapsing, not performing composure, just genuinely processing the weight of a morning that had turned out to contain a version of her death. Thank you, she said. The words were plain and direct, the way real thank yous are, without the additional language people sometimes pile on top to make themselves feel like they've said enough. Ethan nodded. He picked up his toolbox. Down the corridor, Whitfield was on the phone again, and the two agents were coordinating something with Garrett, and the building around them was already beginning to reassemble itself into a space where normal things happened. A cart appeared at the end of the corridor, wheeled by a staff member who looked like he'd been told nothing and was simply doing his job. On the 10th floor of the Ashford Grand, in the executive conference room with its untouched water glasses and its long table and its chairs arranged for a meeting that had never happened, the air was moving at exactly the rate it was supposed to move, clean and adequate and completely unremarkable. Ethan stood in the corridor and finished his coffee. Whitfield's statement process took 4 hours. They moved him to a conference room on the 7th floor. Not the executive suite, a regular working room with a fake wood table and chairs that didn't quite match, and a window that looked at the building next door. Someone brought sandwiches at noon. Ethan ate half of one without tasting it. A junior agent named Torres sat across from him with a recorder and a legal pad, and Ethan walked through the morning in sequence, starting from 6:47 and the ventilation intake on the east wall and moving forward through every step, every observation, every inference he'd drawn, and why he'd drawn it. Torres was good at listening. He didn't interrupt. He wrote things down in the precise, unhurried way of someone who understood that accuracy mattered more than speed. When Ethan finished, Torres looked at his notes for a moment. You said you recognized the operation, Torres said, that it followed tactics from covert sabotage missions you encountered during your service. Similar structure, Ethan said. Multi-layered approach. Each layer is designed to look innocent in isolation. The HVAC modification looks like a maintenance error. The lockdown reprogramming looks like a software update. The pin looks like a gift. The shell company looks like a regional contractor. None of it flags on its own. It only becomes visible when you see all of it at once. And you saw all of it at once. I saw the first piece, the rest followed. Torres wrote something. How long were you a SEAL? Ethan looked at him. It's not in the official statement, Torres said, but Agent Whitfield asked me to get background. 8 years, Ethan said. I left in 2017. And then safety systems engineering. For 4 years. Then I left that too. Torres looked at him with the careful neutrality of someone who wanted to ask the next question but wasn't sure whether he should. Ethan recognized the look. He'd seen it before, in various forms, from various people who'd heard pieces of the story and wanted the rest of it. You don't have to put any of that in the report, Ethan said. No, Torres agreed. I don't. He closed the legal pad. They sat in the room for a moment with the recorder still running, and Ethan thought about the drive home he was going to make in a few hours. The 40-minute commute back to Pilsen, to the apartment with the second-hand furniture and the drawings Maya had taped to the refrigerator and the particular quiet of a space that held exactly 2 people's worth of life. He thought about picking her up from school at 3:15. She was going to ask him about his day. She always asked, and she always listened to the answer longer than most adults did. He wasn't sure what he was going to tell her. Torres reached over and turned off the recorder. Whitfield found him in the 7th floor corridor at 2 in the afternoon, about to take the elevator down. "We need to talk about something," she said. She didn't ask him to come back to the conference room. She stood in the corridor, one shoulder against the wall, with a manila folder in her hand and the expression of someone carrying information they weren't entirely sure how to deliver. "Cole is talking," she said, "not to us directly. His lawyer's doing the talking, but the picture is coming together." Ethan waited. The short position through the Marcus Vail Fund. Cole wasn't just an architect. He was a beneficiary, secondary position, structured through 2 additional shell layers, but it traces back to him. She opened the folder. And this isn't the first time. She handed him a single printed page. It was a summary document, the kind investigators used internally, not the kind that went into official filings. 3 columns: company name, incident type, outcome. He read it. 4 incidents over 7 years. A pharmaceutical company whose CEO had been incapacitated during a key FDA approval meeting, ruled a stress-related cardiac event. A tech firm whose lead engineering team had experienced a mass illness during a critical product launch, attributed to contaminated catering. A private equity fund whose primary decision-maker had suffered a breakdown during acquisition negotiations, diagnosed as a mental health crisis. In each case, the company had gone into crisis. In each case, a short position had paid out. In each case, the people who were supposed to investigate had investigated the obvious explanation and stopped there. Ethan lowered the page. "He's done this 4 times, he said. At minimum. These are the ones we can connect. The synthetic compound in the pin and the intake device. The lab is still running analysis. But the preliminary structure matches something found in trace amounts in the pharmaceutical CEO's blood work from 7 years ago. We missed it then because we weren't looking for it." She paused. "We're looking for it now." He handed the page back. "There's something else," she said. She took a breath, which was the first time all day he'd seen her do anything that looked like preparation. 6 years ago, a safety engineer filed a report with the Illinois Department of Commerce flagging a critical design flaw in a biological containment system at a facility in Peoria. The flaw was significant. If it had gone unaddressed, it could have caused a containment failure that would have had consequences well beyond the facility itself. Ethan looked at the wall. "The report was filed," Whitfield continued, "and then it disappeared. The Department of Commerce has no record of receiving it. The facility has no record of addressing it. And the engineer who filed it, his professional license was challenged on ethics grounds 6 months later. Anonymous complaint. The investigation went nowhere, but the process cost him his contracting relationships, his consulting clients, and eventually his position." She stopped. "The facility in Peoria," Ethan said. His voice was even. "Who held the safety systems contract at the time?" "Meridian Consulting." "And who was Meridian's primary point of contact at the facility?" She looked at him steadily. "Damian Cole. He was VP of operations at the parent company at the time." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. A cartwheel squeaked on the floor. "He buried my report," Ethan said. "We believe so." And then he filed the ethics complaint. He filed it himself. The complaint was anonymous, but the language in it, we have it in archive, matches the phrasing Cole used in an internal email we recovered this morning from his corporate account. Same syntax, same particular way of constructing a false accusation. She closed the folder. "He knew what you'd found. He knew if that report reached the right people, it would expose not just the facility flaw, but the safety culture he'd been cultivating at that company for years. A culture where problems got managed rather than fixed." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "The facility flaw," he said. "Was it ever addressed?" "Meridian filed a revised safety assessment 8 months after your report. The flaw was noted as a minor calibration issue and marked as resolved." She paused. "We're sending a team to Peoria." He looked at the folder in her hands. 6 years. He'd spent 6 years carrying the weight of a decision he hadn't made. The decision to bury the report, to file the complaint, to dismantle the career of a man who'd simply done his job correctly. He'd spent 6 years assuming he'd missed something, made some error in the analysis, come to some wrong conclusion that he couldn't identify because the evidence that would exonerate him had been removed. He hadn't missed anything. He'd been right, and someone had worked very hard to make sure that being right cost him everything he had. Ethan, Whitfield's voice was careful. There are processes now for what happened to you, for the professional damage. The Bureau can facilitate contact with the right people. The Meridian report, the ethics complaint, the license challenge. If Cole engineered all of it, and the evidence suggests he did, then there are remedies. I know about remedies, he said. She looked at him. I know they exist, he said. I know how long they take. I know what they do and don't fix. He took a slow breath. I also know that none of that is why I came to work this morning. I know that, she said quietly. I came because the HVAC system was humming at the wrong frequency. She almost smiled, not quite. Yeah. She handed him a card. Call me tomorrow, or have someone call me on your behalf. There are attorneys who handle professional rehabilitation cases. I can give you names. She paused. You should talk to Claire Ashford, too. She doesn't owe me anything. I didn't say she did. He took the card. Pat. He was in the lobby at 2:45, 3 minutes from walking out the front door, when he heard his name. He turned. Marcus Shaw was crossing the lobby toward him. Claire's bodyguard, the large, close-cropped man who'd been part of her entourage that morning. Ethan had registered him when the SUVs arrived and filed him as professional, competent, and completely unaware of what was happening around him. Both of those last two things in equal measure. Shaw stopped about 5 feet away. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and his jaw set in the particular configuration of a man who needed to say something he hadn't rehearsed. I owe you an apology, Shaw said. Ethan waited. This morning, when security was moving you out of the lobby. Shaw's jaw worked slightly. I saw it happen. I was right there, and I didn't... He stopped. You were trying to tell them something, and I didn't step in. Didn't ask what was happening. I looked at you and I made a call, and the call was wrong. Ethan looked at him. Shaw was not a small man, 6'2", built like someone who took his work seriously and trained for it regularly. He was also, very clearly, not comfortable with what he was doing right now. His discomfort was the real thing, not a performance. What was the call? Ethan asked. Shaw exhaled. That you weren't a credible source of concern. The way you were dressed, the way security was handling you. He shook his head. I've been doing this for 11 years. I'm supposed to be better at reading threat environments than that. You were looking for threats to her, Ethan said. External. The man with the wrong credentials, the vehicle that doesn't fit the pattern. You weren't looking for the building. That's not an excuse. No, Ethan agreed, but it's the reason. Shaw looked at him. She could have died. She didn't. Because of you, not because of me. He said it flatly, without self-pity, just the accounting of someone who needed to be honest about the ledger. I want you to know I understand that. Ethan looked at him for a moment. He thought about the lobby that morning, the security officer's hand on his arm, Garrett's dismissal, the elevator doors closing with Claire inside. The pin, Ethan said. It was given to her in the car on the way here. In your car? Shaw's face changed. Yes. So it came through your security perimeter. Her own team handed it to her. Shaw said nothing. You couldn't have caught that, Ethan said. The chain was designed so that no single person could see the full picture. Priya gave her the pin, but Priya didn't know what it was. It came from Cole's assistant, who may not have known either. He paused. The only way to see it was to already be looking for something wrong, and the only reason I was looking was the ventilation intake. Shaw was quiet for a long moment. You keep going back to that intake. Because that's where it started for me. Everything else was downstream of that. Ethan picked up his toolbox. Don't spend too much time on this morning. Spend it on the next time. Shaw looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, not absolution. Something more complicated and more honest than either of those. He extended his hand. Ethan shook it. He was almost at the door when Garrett materialized from the direction of the security office. walking with the slightly urgent purposefulness of a man who'd been looking for someone and finally found them. "Ryder?" Ethan stopped. Garrett caught up to him. He looked tired in a way that was different from the morning's tiredness. This was the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been wrong about something important and spent the afternoon sitting with that fact. "Miss Ashford wants to see you," he said, "before you leave." Ethan looked at his watch. He had 30 minutes before he needed to leave for school pickup. Where on? She was in the hotel's ground floor business lounge, a room off the lobby with actual decent chairs and a coffee service and windows that looked out at the street. The merger team had apparently set it up as a staging area that morning, because there were document cases stacked near one wall and a whiteboard someone had half erased. The remnants of a plan for a day that had happened differently than anyone expected. Claire was at the table near the window with a coffee she wasn't drinking and a phone she'd set face down. Priya wasn't with her. No one was with her. Ethan had the impression she'd arranged it that way deliberately. She looked up when he came in. "Sit down," she said. Then, a beat later, "Please." He sat. She looked at him across the table. She'd put the blazer back on at some point, but she still had the sleeves of the blouse pushed up, and her hair was still less controlled than it had been. She looked like someone who'd had a full and serious day and was not pretending otherwise. "The FBI told me about the Peoria report," she said. He hadn't expected that. He kept his face still. "They didn't tell me everything," she said. "They told me enough." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup without drinking from it. "You filed a safety report 6 years ago that Damien buried, and then Damien destroyed your career. He tried to. He succeeded." Ethan looked at her. "I have a job. I have a daughter. I have an apartment in Pilsen with furniture I bought used and a refrigerator with drawings taped to it." He paused. "He didn't destroy my life. He changed what it looked like." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face was working through something. "The facility in Peoria," she said. "What was the flaw?" He almost didn't answer. It was an old wound, specific and technical, and describing it meant going back inside it. But she was asking because she needed to know, not because she was curious. The biological containment system was using a pressure differential model that assumed continuous seal integrity, he said. The model was based on the manufacturer's spec, but the actual installation had a gasket configuration that degraded under thermal cycling, standard operational temperatures, nothing extreme. Over time, a hot-cold cycle that happened every night when the HVAC system ran its overnight reset would cause microfractures in 3 specific seal points. He looked at the table. In the event of a containment breach, the system was designed to detect pressure loss and trigger lockdown. But because the seal degradation was microscale, the pressure loss would fall below the sensor threshold. The system would read normal. The breach would be invisible. The room was quiet. "How long before the gaskets failed completely?" Claire asked. "Based on the thermal cycling rate and the material degradation curve I modeled, between 14 and 22 months from installation." He paused. "The facility had been operational for 9 months when I filed the report." She set down the coffee cup. "And Damien buried it. And Meridian filed a revised assessment calling it a minor calibration issue. Which means the facility kept operating for at least another 8 months before Meridian's revised assessment suggested any corrective action. What corrective action they actually took, I don't know." He looked at her. "Whitfield said they're sending a team." Claire was quiet for a long moment. She was looking at the window, at the street outside, at the gray Chicago afternoon that had accumulated while everything else was happening inside this building. "I hired Damien 6 years ago," she said. 8 months after you filed that report. He came with excellent references. He'd just left the parent company of that Peoria facility, pursuing new opportunities, the reference letter said. She paused. "I thought I was a good judge of people." "You run a billion-dollar company." "You probably are. I employed the man who tried to kill me for 6 years. He's also the man who kept that employment uncomplicated by doing his job well." Ethan looked at her. "That's what makes it possible. If he were obviously bad at his job, you'd have found reasons to let him go. He was good at it. Good at everything except the thing he was secretly doing." She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "You were good at your job too," she said. "The report, the Peoria facility, this morning, all of it." He didn't say anything. Whitfield said you left your engineering career after what Damien did, that you went into maintenance work. She said it without judgment, but directly, in the way she seemed to say everything. Why maintenance? He thought about how to answer that. The real answer was layered in a way that didn't compress easily, but she was asking the real question, not the polite version of it. When I got out of the Navy, I went into the engineering work because I wanted to do something that mattered without the violence, he said. The safety systems work, finding the thing that could go wrong before it went wrong, fixing it. It felt like the same purpose with different tools. He paused. After Meridian, after the license challenge, I couldn't work in the field. The ethics investigation cleared me, technically, but by then the contracting relationships were gone and the reputation was... He stopped. I had Maya. She was 18 months old. Her mother had left 6 months earlier. I needed work that didn't require a reputation, just a skill set. Maintenance, Claire said. It turned out I was good at it. And it turned out that being good at it meant the same thing it had always meant. Finding what was wrong before it became a disaster. She looked at him for a long moment. This morning, she said. The ventilation intake. Yes. Anyone else would have logged it as a maintenance note. I know. Why didn't you? He thought about it. The real answer was that by the time he'd gotten to the HVAC panel and seen the configuration, the intake hum, and the modified settings, and the Apex contractor's name had assembled themselves into a shape he recognized. Not intellectually. He hadn't sat down and reasoned through it step by step. He'd recognized it the way you recognized a voice you hadn't heard in years. Something in him had just known. Experience, he said, and the fact that I wasn't in a hurry. She almost smiled. Not in a hurry. Security was in a hurry. Hal was in a hurry. Everyone was managing the event timeline. He looked at his toolbox sitting on the floor beside his chair. I was just inspecting a building. I wasn't trying to get to the next thing. Claire looked at the toolbox, then at him. The merger is suspended, she said. Indefinitely. I've notified the board and the acquisition team. She picked up her coffee again. The company I was acquiring, the one the Marcus Vail Fund was short on, their board needs to know that their valuation drop is coming regardless now that this is public. I've got lawyers on that. She paused. And I have an executive team that's missing its COO, an investigation that's going to run for months, and a board that's going to spend the next several weeks looking at me very carefully. That sounds like a difficult few months, he said. Yes, she said it without complaint. What are your plans? He looked at her. I'm picking up my daughter from school at 3:15 Che. She looked at him for a moment and then she did smile. A small one, slightly tired, genuine. After that, she said, same as usual. I've got 2 more inspection contracts this week. Friday morning is a commercial building in the West Loop. She set down her coffee. I want to offer you something, she said. Not now. The timing is obviously wrong, and frankly, I need to think clearly before I make offers of any kind, and I am not thinking entirely clearly today. She was speaking carefully, picking her words. But I want you to know that what you did this morning, not just this morning, but the Peoria report, the pattern of doing the right thing when it costs you something, that's not something I'm going to forget. He looked at her steadily. You don't owe me anything. I'm not talking about debt. She met his eyes. I'm talking about what I want the people around me to look like. He was quiet for a moment. My reputation, he said. The Meridian episode, the license challenge. It's in the record. I know. Anyone who looks me up finds the complaint. Then we'll make sure that anyone who looks you up also finds everything that came after it, she said. The full picture. He thought about Maya, who was going to ask about his day. He thought about the Peoria report, 19 pages of technical analysis, precise and careful, sitting somewhere in an archive that no one had looked at in 6 years. He thought about the 9 months he'd spent after the license challenge, trying to understand what he'd done wrong, methodically reviewing his own methodology, his own conclusions, looking for the error he must have made because the alternative, that he'd been right and someone had simply destroyed him for it, had seemed at the time too bleak to accept. He'd been right. He'd spent 6 years not quite knowing it, and now he knew it, and the knowing settled into him in a way he hadn't expected. Not triumphant, not even particularly relieving, just solid. the way the ground felt after a long time at sea. "I need to go pick up my daughter," he said. "I know." Claire stood. "I'll be in touch." He stood too, picked up his toolbox. At the door he stopped. "The board meeting," he said. "When you present the evidence, the surveillance logs, the HVAC records, the Apex documentation, make sure Whitfield's team sends you the Peoria file as well." She looked at him. "Cole's pattern goes back 7 years," he said. "Your board needs to understand that this morning wasn't an aberration. It was the latest iteration of something he'd been refining for a long time." He paused. "They need to see the full shape of it." She held his gaze. "I'll make sure they do." He walked out through the lobby, past the fountain and the expensive light and the polished stone floor, past the spot near the service desk where he'd stood that morning, watching the elevator indicator climb toward 10. The afternoon crowd moved around him. Check-ins, departures, a tour group assembling near the entrance, a businessman on a phone call walking in quick circles. He went through the revolving door and out onto the sidewalk. Michigan Avenue in February at 3 o'clock was cold in the particular Chicago way. Not just temperature, but the lakeside wind that found the gaps in your clothing and stayed there. He walked to where he'd parked the truck, 3 blocks south in a public lot, and he drove to Maya's school. She was standing outside with her backpack on both shoulders and her winter coat not quite zipped because she always forgot the last 6 inches of zipper, and she spotted his truck from halfway across the pickup lane and started toward him in the loping, unselfconscious way of a 7-year-old who was not yet aware that adults tried to look casual. She climbed in. "How was your day?" she asked, which was her opening move every day. Partly because she'd learned it from him, but mostly because she genuinely wanted to know. He pulled out of the lot and merged into traffic. "Interesting," he said. She accepted this. She turned and looked out the window at the buildings going past, and she told him about the argument she'd had with her teacher about whether a square counted as a rectangle. So she was correct, she said, because all squares met the definition of rectangles, even if not all rectangles were squares. And the teacher had eventually agreed, which Maya considered a victory, but was being gracious about. Ethan listened. He merged onto the highway. Behind him, the Ashford Grand's glass facade caught the late afternoon light and held it for a moment, pale and flat and winter white, before the city folded it into everything else and it was gone. 3 weeks passed before Ethan heard from Claire Ashford again. In that time, the world moved the way it always moved when something that had almost been catastrophic became instead a legal proceeding. Quickly at first, then slowly, in the grinding institutional way of courts and filings and press releases drafted by communications teams who were paid specifically to make dramatic things sound orderly. The arrest of Damian Cole made the financial press before it made the general news, which told you something about what kind of story people decided it was. Fraud, market manipulation, conspiracy. The words were accurate, but they were also clean in a way the actual morning hadn't been. Ethan read one article about it and then stopped reading. His life in those 3 weeks was the life it had always been. The West Loop inspection on Friday went without incident. A standard commercial building with a functional HVAC system and a property manager who offered him coffee and left him alone to work. The following week, he had 3 jobs, 2 of which ran long, and a parent-teacher conference at Maya's school where her teacher told him, with the careful phrasing of an educator trying to say something diplomatically, that Maya had a strong sense of her own correctness that sometimes made collaborative work challenging. Ethan told her that was probably accurate and something they were both working on. He drove home from that conference thinking about what it meant to raise a child who was confident in her own assessments of things. Whether you cultivated it or softened it or just let it run and hoped the world didn't beat it out of her before she was old enough to protect it herself. He didn't have a good answer. He usually didn't. His phone rang on a Tuesday morning while he was eating cereal at the kitchen table with Maya's latest drawing in front of him. A horse, approximately, with 6 legs and a very serious expression. He didn't recognize the number. "Mr. Ryder," a man's voice, professional, slightly formal. "My name is Andrew Kessler. I'm general counsel for Ashford Dynamics. Ms. Ashford asked me to reach out to schedule a meeting." Ethan looked at the 6-legged horse. "When?" he said. Mbc. Ashford Dynamics occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower on Wacker Drive, which Ethan had driven past hundreds of times without ever going inside. The lobby was the kind of lobby that told you, quietly but clearly, that the company that occupied this building had decided presentation was also a form of argument. The receptionist on the executive floor was expecting him. She was professional without being warm, which he appreciated. Warmth from strangers who didn't know him always put him slightly on edge. She walked him to a conference room and told him Miss Ashford would be with him shortly. He stood near the window and looked at the river below. Claire arrived 7 minutes later with Andrew Kessler and a woman Ethan hadn't met. Mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up on her head, the slightly impatient energy of someone who had 3 other places to be and was choosing to be here instead. "Ethan," Claire said. She extended her hand and he shook it. Her grip was the same as everything else about her. Direct, no performance. "This is Renata Voss. She chairs our board." Renata shook his hand and looked at him with the frank assessment of someone who'd spent a career sizing up people quickly. "We've heard a great deal about you," she said. "I imagine." They sat. Claire had a folder on the table in front of her, which she didn't open immediately. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the business lounge 3 weeks ago. Directly, without the social lubrication most people use to make directness less uncomfortable. "The investigation," she said, "where things stand. Cole has been charged on 7 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and attempted aggravated assault. The assault charge comes from the pin and the dispersal device, which the lab confirmed contained a synthetic incapacitant specifically harmful to someone with a cardiac arrhythmia." She paused. "The FBI has connected the Veil Fund short position to Cole through 3 shell layers. 2 of his co-conspirators have already entered cooperation agreements." "And the previous incidents?" Ethan asked. "The pharmaceutical company, the tech firm?" "All 3 prior incidents are now open investigations," Kessler said. "The pharmaceutical CEO's case is the strongest. The compound traces match closely enough that the original ruling is being formally reviewed." He set his pen on the table. "We expect Cole to face additional charges before the year is out." Ethan nodded. "The Peoria facility," Claire said. "The FBI team found what you said they'd find. The gasket configuration, the thermal cycling degradation, the corrective work Meridian filed after your report was cosmetic. They addressed the surface indicators and left the underlying design flaw in place." She looked at him steadily. "The facility has been shut down pending a full remediation. Meridian Consulting has been served with a formal notice of investigation." Ethan looked at the river outside the window. 7 years. The facility had operated for 7 years with a containment flaw that should have been fixed in the first year. Nothing catastrophic had happened in that time. The probability math had held. The failure hadn't landed in the bad part of the distribution. But it could have. On any given night, in any given thermal cycle, it could have. "Your report is now part of the official record," Kessler said. "The Illinois Department of Commerce has formally acknowledged receiving it, which is the department's way of acknowledging it was received and suppressed. The ethics complaint against your license has been formally expunged." He paused. "We've also been in contact with the Engineering Licensing Board. Your reinstatement as a licensed safety systems engineer is, in their words, a procedural matter at this point." Ethan looked at him. "How long will the procedure take?" 4 to 6 weeks, possibly less." He sat with that for a moment. 6 years of being a man with an expunged record, and it turned out the expungement itself could be expunged. He wasn't sure what he felt about it, not the uncomplicated relief he might have expected. Something more complicated, the feeling of a weight lifting that you'd carried so long you'd stopped noticing it was there. "There's something we'd like to offer you," Claire said, "and I want to be clear that it's an offer, not an obligation, and I'm not trying to do something for you out of guilt or because I think I owe you a debt. I think we've already established you're uncomfortable with that framing." "I am," he said. "Good. So." She opened the folder. "Ashford Dynamics is creating a new position. Vice President of Safety and Infrastructure Integrity. It's a new function. We've never had it, which is part of how we ended up in the situation we were in." She slid a document across the table. "The role would oversee safety systems across all our facilities with direct reporting to the CEO. The mandate would be genuine, not compliance theater, not a box-checking function. The actual work of finding what's wrong before it becomes a disaster." Ethan looked at the document without picking it up. There's a condition I want to put on my acceptance, he said. If I accept. Claire looked at him. What condition? Anyone in the company, maintenance staff, lab technicians, administrative personnel, anyone, has to have a formal protected mechanism to flag a safety concern without going through their direct management chain. No filtering, no delay, no risk to their position for using it. He paused. The reason Cole could do what he did over 7 years is that the people who might have seen pieces of it had no safe way to say anything. That has to change. Renata Voss, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. That's not a small cultural change, she said. No, Ethan agreed. It isn't. It means accepting that sometimes a maintenance worker's concern takes precedence over an executive's schedule. Sometimes it does. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Claire. He's right, Renata said, which appeared to be the most words she intended to spend on the matter. Claire looked at Ethan. The mechanism you're describing, we can build it. It'll take time to do it properly, but we can build it. She paused. Is there anything else? He thought about it. The Peoria facility workers, he said. When the remediation is complete and the facility restarts, if it restarts, the people who worked there need to know what the actual risk level was during the years they were in that building. They have a right to know. Claire nodded once. I'll make sure that's part of the remediation agreement. Ethan picked up the document. He read it the way he read everything, thoroughly, without hurrying, noting where the language was specific and where it was vague and what the vague parts might be trying to accommodate. Kessler watched him without comment, which was the correct response from a lawyer watching someone read a contract. After 8 minutes, he set it down. I'll need a week, he said. I have existing contracts with 3 clients. I won't leave them without coverage. Of course, Claire said. And I have a daughter. He looked at her directly. The role, the travel component, the hours. I need those to be real numbers, not aspirational ones. We can structure the role around a primary Chicago base, Kessler said. Travel is needed, but Ms. Ashford runs a domestic primary operation. Then I'll take the week, Ethan said. He stood. Claire stood. They shook hands across the table, and he was aware that the handshake meant something different than it had 3 weeks ago in the hotel corridor. Less urgent, more considered. The difference between 2 people who'd survived a morning together and 2 people who were deciding what came next. He called Desmond on the way home. I heard, she said, before he'd said anything. You always hear. I have sources. A pause. Are you going to take it? He drove for a moment without answering. The city moved past him, a city he'd lived in for 11 years that he knew in the particular way you know a place when you've moved through its maintenance infrastructure, its basements and mechanical rooms, and access chases. He knew where the old buildings hid their original plumbing and where the new ones cut corners on insulation, and which parking structures had water infiltration problems that would eventually become structural ones. Yes, he said. Good. Her voice was dry. You've been wasted on inspection contracts. I liked inspection contracts. You liked finding problems. Same thing. She laughed. Then she was quiet for a moment. Ethan? The Peoria report. How long did you spend thinking you'd made a mistake? He considered the question honestly. A long time. But you kept doing the same work. I kept doing the only work I knew how to do. That's not the same as giving up. No, he agreed. It isn't. He hung up and drove the rest of the way home in the specific quiet of a Tuesday afternoon that was ordinary in all the ways the day 3 weeks ago hadn't been. And he told Maya that night after dinner while they were doing dishes. She washed, he dried, which was their arrangement because she liked the water and he liked having something in his hands. I'm changing jobs, he said. She looked at him. Suds on her forearms, very serious expression. To what? Safety engineering, like I used to do before you were born. She thought about this. Is it more interesting than inspecting buildings? Probably. Do you get to find more things that are wrong? He looked at her. That's basically the whole job. She turned back to the dishes. Then you should take it. He dried a plate and set it in the cabinet. Dad, she said. Yeah. The building thing. The one you did a few weeks ago. She handed him a glass without looking at him. Were you scared? He thought about the service chase on 10, the narrow space and the bad light, and the thing he'd found in the intake housing. He thought about the corridor outside room 1004 and the coffee Garrett had given him, and the specific, contained feeling of knowing something was wrong and not yet knowing if he was going to be able to fix it. A little, he said, in a useful way. She accepted this with the equanimity of a 7-year-old who had decided her father's answers were generally honest and therefore worth taking at face value. Okay, she said, and handed him another glass. The board presentation happened on a Thursday, 5 weeks after the morning at the Ashford Grand. Ethan had been in his new role for 8 days, still learning the organizational structure, still meeting the people who ran the facilities across Ashford Dynamics' 6 sites, still getting a sense of what the actual safety culture looked like versus what the policies said it should look like, which were always different in ways that told you exactly what a company cared about. Claire had asked him to be present for the board meeting. Not to present, Kessler and the forensic investigators would present the evidence, but to be there. He hadn't entirely understood why until he was in the room. The Ashford Dynamics boardroom held 14 people. Renata Voss at the head of the table, 11 board members arranged along the sides, Claire at the near end, Claire Soute et Sut, Ethan in a chair along the wall, slightly outside the main configuration, which was where consultants and observers sat and which suited him fine. The presentation ran 90 minutes. Kessler walked through the evidence in the methodical, unglamorous way that legal presentations worked. Documents, timestamps, financial records, chain of custody, technical analysis. He showed the HVAC configuration records and the Sentinel-4 logs and the Apex Systems Solutions corporate registration and the Vail Fund short position and the 4 prior incidents reconstructed in enough detail that the pattern was impossible to miss. When he showed the Peoria file, the original 19-page report from 6 years ago, time-stamped, with Ethan's license number and signature at the bottom, followed by the Department of Commerce suppression documentation, the room was quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of people who run organizations looking at what an organization had allowed to happen and doing the private accounting of what that cost. Renata asked 3 questions. All 3 were precise and went to the structural issues, not what had happened, but how the conditions had existed to allow it. After Kessler finished, Claire spoke for 8 minutes. She talked about the new safety infrastructure function, the protected reporting mechanism, the cultural change she was asking the board to mandate and resource. She talked about it without the language of crisis management, not as a response to what had happened, but as something the company should have built a long time ago. Then she said, "I want to say something about Ethan Ryder." He'd been looking at the table. He looked up. He came into this building on a Thursday morning in a worn work shirt with a toolbox he's had for longer than he'd probably like to admit, she said. He was there to do a routine inspection. He had no particular reason to look harder than the job required. He had no history with this company, no stake in our merger, no connection to anything that was happening on the executive floor. She paused. He found what he found because he was paying attention and because he followed what he found even when every person with authority in that building told him to stop. She looked at him. He also filed a safety report 6 years ago that would have prevented real harm, and that report was buried by the same man who was engineering what happened that Thursday. He paid for filing that report with his career, his professional reputation, and 6 years of living a smaller life than the one he'd built. She stopped. I don't think Ethan would want me to frame this as a story about a wrong that's been righted, because I'm not sure wrongs work that way. I'm not sure you can right them exactly. But I can tell you that the instinct that made him file that report in 2018 is the same instinct that made him keep following the intake hum on a Thursday morning when he had every reason to log it and move on. The room was quiet. That instinct, she said, is what I want in every room of this company. Ethan looked at the table again. He was not comfortable with what he was feeling, which was a reasonable response to being spoken about accurately in a room full of strangers. Not the flattery. He'd have been fine dismissing flattery. The accuracy was what was hard to sit with. Being seen correctly by someone you respected was its own kind of weight. After the meeting, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Renata Voss stopped him. She looked at him with the same frank assessment from their first meeting, but something in it had shifted. "The reporting mechanism you proposed," she said. "Protected channels, direct to the safety function, no management filtering." "Yes. I've been on boards for 22 years. She put her reading glasses back on, which appeared to be her way of indicating that she was returning to work. No one has ever proposed something that obvious. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. She walked away. The Ashford Grand was not Ethan's regular territory. He had no reason to go back to it. He went back anyway, on a Saturday morning in March with Maya, because she'd asked him to take her somewhere with a fancy lobby, her exact words, and the Ashford Grand had the fanciest lobby he knew personally. They went in through the main entrance, the revolving door, the limestone and the brass fixtures and the fountain running quietly against the far wall. Maya looked up at the ceiling. "It's really tall," she said, 40 feet, approximately. "How do you know?" "I work with buildings." She accepted this and walked toward the fountain. He stood near the entrance and looked at the lobby. The east wall with the ventilation intake grill 8 feet up, above the decorative planter. From here he could see it clearly. The grill was clean, properly seated, the housing behind it restored to its correct configuration. The air handler for this floor was running at proper differential, pushing air through the system at the rate it was supposed to, quiet and adequate and completely unremarkable. He looked at the spot near the service desk where he'd stood in February, watching the elevator indicator climb to 10. He looked at the front entrance, where Claire's SUVs had pulled up at 6:47 a.m. and she'd come through the revolving door already in motion, already committed to the day she'd planned. He thought about the shape of things, about how a morning that had contained a plan 7 years in the making had been interrupted by a maintenance worker who noticed a sound. Not a loud sound, not an alarm, just a hum that was slightly lower than it should have been, in a frequency range that most people moved through without registering. He'd registered it because he was paying attention. He was paying attention because attention was the only tool he'd had left after everything else was taken. There was something in that worth understanding, not a lesson exactly. He was suspicious of the word lesson, of the way it implied that hard things had clean takeaways. But something. You could take a man's credentials and his career and his professional standing. You could take the architecture of the life he'd built and reduce it to the studs. And if the man had real skill, not the performance of skill, not the credential of skill, but the actual thing, it stayed. It went with him into the smaller life. It showed up in maintenance contracts and worn toolboxes and the capacity to hear a wrong frequency in a lobby at 6:47 in the morning. You couldn't take the knowing. You could only take the room in which it was recognized. "Dad?" Maya was standing at the edge of the fountain, looking back at him. "Can we get hot chocolate?" He picked up his toolbox. He'd brought it from the truck out of habit, or maybe not entirely out of habit, and walked toward her across the marble floor. "There's a place 2 blocks north," he said. "Better than whatever they charge here." She fell into step beside him, pulling her coat zipper up, in that way she had of starting and never quite finishing. He reached over and zipped it the last 6 inches without breaking stride, the way he'd done it 100 times. They went out through the revolving door. The March air hit them, still cold, but differently cold than February, with something underneath it that suggested the city was considering, eventually, a change. Maya grabbed his free hand and they walked north on Michigan Avenue among the Saturday morning crowd. He didn't look back at the building. He didn't need to. The knowing went with him, the way it always had, the way it always would, through whatever room recognized it and through every room that didn't, equally. That was the thing about real skill, about the kind of integrity that wasn't performed for an audience. It didn't need the audience to exist. It just kept doing what it did. In a building somewhere in this city, a ventilation intake was humming at the exact frequency it was supposed to hum. An air handler was running clean. A seal was holding. A system was doing what systems do when they are properly maintained and honestly assessed and cared for by someone who knows what right sounds like. Ethan Ryder walked up Michigan Avenue in March with his toolbox in one hand and his daughter's hand in the other, and the city moved around them both, and that was enough. That had always been enough.